And even though we're in a crazy time, which is preventing us from using the TV studio, there is a silver lining. I'm able to bring you guests from around the world and with exotic stories that I wouldn't necessarily be able to bring to my studio. And today is another one of those individuals. So, hello, Michelle. How are you?
Hi, I'm well, thanks. How are you, Lee?
Terrific. So this is Michelle Villalobos. She is going to tell us a story today, which, although is something you'd normally see on 2020 or 60 Minutes, fact, sometimes real life is crazier than fiction. And you've heard of movies like Sleeping with the Enemy, which are just mind-boggling. They become movies. And Michelle has a story like that to tell. Now, I wanted to quickly start with her background so you can understand that things like this can happen to anybody. Michelle is a successful businesswoman. She's a certified speaking professional. She was one of the few female members in the NSA's $1 Million Speaking Club. She has created entrepreneurial events in Miami, their largest women's events, 11 times. And she is the owner and CEO of a large speaking academy. And yet, crazy things happen. Like I said, they can happen to anybody. They can happen to people in the spotlight or famous, not famous, rich, poor, it doesn't matter. So here's this crazy successful person with a crazy experience. So Michelle, thank you. I know you have never told this story publicly before, and I appreciate you coming on so much because not only is it just an amazing story, but I think there's a learning in there that you're gonna teach us. So tell us your story. How did this craziness begin? We're going to build into what happened to you.
Well, many years ago, I met a man who I felt kind of head over heels in love with. He was very suave. He had great stories. He was animated and charismatic, I would say. Not everybody would agree. And he came on really strong. You know, he from day one, he complimented me and he was flattering and he called when he said he was going to call and he would text all the time and say nice things and send flowers when he would go out of town, or when I would go out of town and come back, there'd be flowers waiting. And, you know, I just thought, well, wow, this is what a romance is. And I've been waiting all these years to have this experience, and it's finally here. And I just let myself be taken in very quickly by it. And we ended up dating for 2.5 years. And during those 2.5 years, a lot of strange things happened, but I became so invested in the fairy tale that the first 6 months were, that I pushed aside all the red flags and ignored and, you know, focused on work, or, you know, blamed myself for things that happened. But ultimately, it turned out he was not a great guy. You know, what I discovered 2.5 years in.
So can I just ask, like, what are the weird things that are happening that you'd ignore? Because I think women often do this. There'll be a sign and they go, it's everything's great, right? Because you met Prince Charming.
Yeah. Well, Lee, what he did was, or what happened was, there were always these big stories. Like, it was always big drama around him. Like, I would be talking to him on the phone and he was supposedly at a gas station, and he'd be like, "Oh my God, someone just stole my car. I gotta go. I'll call you back." And then he'd disappear for like 10 hours, you know, and I'd be like, "Did you get your car back? Like, what happened?" It was always this big elaborate story, you know, and in hindsight later, I don't believe that any of those things actually happened. Like, oh, I was in the parking lot coming out of this restaurant, I got beat up by somebody, and, you know, and now I'm, you know, in bed. And I think that those stories were cover stories for alcoholism, for, you know, nefarious activities, which
but at
I don't
the time, you had no reason to not believe him.
No. But my intuition, and this is the lesson, and this is why I am telling this story, because I don't want this to be my story. As you mentioned, like, I have a business, I have a mission, I have a message, and this isn't it.
Right.
And it brought me low, it brought me down, and it was a real huge breakdown in my life that, you know, that actually I'm very grateful for, because it led me on a new path. It broke me all the way down, opened me up, like total vulnerability, total breakdown, total having to look at myself very like, why did I put up with this? Why did I not say something or do something? How come I didn't question this more? How come I didn't leave? Right.
And so he told you these weird stories. And then when did it start to really break down for you?
So in January of a certain year, I'm not going to say when exactly, but in January or early February, he went on a business trip. I was traveling a lot and he was traveling a lot. So we weren't seeing each other as much as usual. We weren't living together. We had our own places. And so I would go out of town, come back, he would go out of town. And it started to be like, he started going out of town a lot more. He started traveling a lot more for work. He had supposedly, he said that he had just gotten a big promotion. He claimed that he was now a VP of a Fortune 100 company. And I believed it. I had no reason not to. Well, I had plenty of reasons not to, but not consciously, right? And so in January, he went on one of these trips, and when he came back in the car, essentially, he sort of proposed to get married. And I was like, you know, kind of imagined it being a little more romantic than this, but you know, I was like, okay, yeah, you know, okay. So I agreed to get married, and we started telling people. And before that, in the car, he said, and by the way, you need to get life insurance. And I was like, okay, really? Because I don't have kids. He's like, yeah, but that's what married people do. You put each other on your life insurance policy, and you can use life insurance as an investment. Like, he made all these, you know, rational sounding, you know, arguments, although it wasn't an argument. And I was like, okay, you know, but then I didn't do it. And he reminded me a couple of times, like, oh, are you going to get that life insurance we talked about? And I just dismissed it. I didn't think about it. But things started to unravel, like in that first part of the year. He was supposed to not be drinking. He had the year before he had stopped drinking. And so he was not a drinker anymore, because he had been a heavy drinker, and it had been a problem in our relationship. And I had put my foot down there and said, either you quit or I'm out. And so he quit. But what happened was, in that first few months of that year, I would come back from the trips and it would smell like he'd been drinking, or I found empty bottles in the garbage, the garbage bins outside. And then he would say, what are you doing? Are you investigating me? Those aren't mine. They're the neighbors. So there's always an excuse. And I was always the crazy one, right? So these things started to happen. And then one weekend in particular, one Sunday, I'd come back from a trip on Friday, and he woke me up at 5 a.m. and he looked crazy. He was sweating. He was nervous. He was agitated. One of his eyes was like kind of off kilter. It didn't look like he was, you know, he almost had like a lazy eye, which I'd never noticed before, and he didn't have before. And he was sweating, and he basically had this really severe panic attack, or paranoia attack. Like, he thought there were cameras all over his house. He thought people were listening to our conversations. He brought me into the bathroom and turned on all the faucets so that we could talk, because he said people were listening. And I'm like, I could tell that he was having some sort of paranoid, psychotic kind of episode. And I thought it was because he hadn't been sleeping. He hadn't been sleeping. And, you know, I knew that lack of sleep could lead to delusions and things like that. So, long story short, he told me some crazy story about how I don't want to get into like all the nitty gritty details, but essentially some crazy story about how he had cheated on me on his recent trip to Chicago, and that he was really sorry, and that now somebody was trying to blackmail him because they knew that he had done this. And so he was telling me, and I, obviously got really upset. I left. And then he called me a couple hours later, not remembering any of this, not remembering what he had said, not remembering what had happened. He had apparently called the police, and the police were at his house, and he couldn't remember why. I mean, it was just this whole crazy thing. And he's like, please come back. That was a crazy story. I think it was a delusion. And I I went back, I went back to his house and I tried to take care of him. I was like, look, you need to sleep. You're delusional because you're not sleeping. But he couldn't sleep. I gave him a couple Benadryl to see if it would calm him down. He wouldn't calm down.
So it's another one of his wild stories that, again, you had no reason to believe wasn't true.
Well, at this point,
although it's the first one involving you, though, right? There was the first story where you were part of it. And but interesting too, just so, look for signs. So has a drinking problem. He tells you he quit. You don't think he did. Was he possibly doing drugs too? Or was it?
I think so. So finally, that day I spent the whole day at his house. I called his best friend over and I'm like, listen, you need to help me here because he was talking to walls. He was talking to faucets. He was moving furniture around and he was seeing things. He was hearing things. And I was like, you know what? This sounds familiar. And I looked it up and I was like, oh, these are the exact symptoms of alcohol withdrawal, delirium tremens. So I basically diagnosed him, called his best friend over to get the guns out of the house because he was a gun collector. And I'm like, you know what? Let's not have these guns around, get them out of here, please. And ultimately, he and I spent the whole day trying to tame this guy, my boyfriend, and we finally took him to the hospital. And in the hospital, we're sitting, finally, we waited, and then we got into the room, and we're sitting, like, he's on the bed, laid down, kind of propped up. The doctor is next to him. I'm across from the doctor on his other side, and his friend is on the other, facing him in the room. So all four of us are gathered around in this hospital room, and the doctor says, he says to my boyfriend, he asks him, have you ever had, who's somewhat lucid, but not really, he's like spaced out. The doctor asks him, have you ever had gastric bypass surgery? And he doesn't answer, but I say no at the exact same time that his best friend who's sitting there says yes. And I look at his friend, I'm like, what? And he looks at me, he's like, you didn't know? I'm like, no. And the doctor looks at both of us. He's like, I think you guys need to wait outside. Because you
got a whole other part of his life opening up now that you knew nothing about.
Yeah. And the doctor, when he came out later, afterwards, he came out and we talked to him. The doctor said, well, that's a very common it happens a lot with alcoholism, actually. That people who have gastric bypass and continue to drink very often become alcoholics. It's a common thing because their body just like the alcohol goes straight into their bloodstream or something like that. So they have a lower tolerance and then they often develop dependency. But I didn't know I didn't know he had been obese. Actually, I mean, I knew he'd been heavier and that he'd lost weight, but never in a million years did he tell me that he'd had gastric bypass or anything like that. So that was my first. So we were outside of that doctor's office. I'm with the best friend and the doctor leaves. And the doctor says, I think you're right. He has delirium tremens, alcohol withdrawal. And it's not something we can test for because once they're having the withdrawal, the alcohol's out of their system. So we just have to go by symptomology. And that's my diagnosis. I'm like, okay, so here we go. And so the doctor leaves and I go to his best friend. I said, did you and he ever have a business that you sold for $16 million? And the friend looks at me and he laughs. He's like, what? No, we never sold that business. We never barely made a profit on that business, much less millions of dollars. He's like laughing. And then he stops. He looks at me. He's like, are you going to have this big famous band play at your wedding? And I'm like, no, we can't. I'm not going to spend money like that on a wedding. That's ridiculous.
So the story is, this is interesting. So his friend was also, he was telling everybody stories, not just you.
Oh yeah. I was just one of many.
Had you known the friend, like before you met him in the hospital, had you known him before?
A little bit, but one of the interesting things in hindsight was that he didn't have many friends.
Interesting.
Right? He couldn't maintain them, I guess. So this guy was kind of a reason.
World.
Because he was a liar.
Yeah.
And he would lie, apparently, for the hell of it. Not for any real good reason, just because he could. Because it was more fun than telling the truth, is what from all my research, that's kind of a common thing, that they lie just because they can.
Because they can. Because it just makes, I don't know. It just
asserts control. It's like, haha, I know something you don't.
So he doesn't have friends.
Doesn't really have.
He's an alcoholic. I mean, he's detoxing. He's not recovering. He's detoxing.
He's withdrawing.
And the gastric bypass, really interesting. I never knew that about.
Me either.
That you'd become dependent. All right, so now you're going to have this amazing rock band worth thousands, millions of dollars at your wedding, but you're not.
A merengue band, actually, a merengue band. And so so I remember that moment where the friend and I are looking at each other. We're both like, holy shit. He lied to both of us. I wonder, and immediately the question is, what else did he lie about, right? And so somehow it happened that night. So they finally come in. The doctor comes back to the room and says to him, I have a diagnosis for you. You have alcohol withdrawal. You're having delirium tremens, which is very dangerous. Left untreated, it can be deadly. You're very lucky your friends brought you in here today. And he's like, that's impossible because I don't drink. And he denied it and denied it and denied it to the doctor. And the doctor said, well, either you have alcohol withdrawal or you have he said that this way, he said, you either have the most textbook case of alcohol withdrawal or the most unusual non-textbook case of schizophrenia that I've ever seen. And my boyfriend says, well, then it must be schizophrenia. Like, straight up.
It just must be. Okay.
That's how committed he was to that lie.
Wow. All right. So where do you go from here? I mean, he's your fiance at this point, right? Let me ask you, is there a ring?
No.
There's no ring. Okay. Because you're having $1 million wedding. He sold a $16 million. All right. So what are you learning from the friend now? Because I have a feeling you're going to uncover more.
Well, we found other lies, but that, eventually they shot him, my boyfriend, full of like Ativan and tranquilizers. So he was going to be out the whole night, and I ended up with his phone. And I had the password because I used it to call his friend to come help us.
Right.
So I spent the entire night till 10 o'clock the next morning going through his phone.
Oh, do tell. What did you find? This is sounding interesting.
Everything.
Got to get some juicy details here.
Oh, Jesus. I mean, well, first of all, like I had never spied on a boyfriend before, ever, except for one time that I accidentally opened a boyfriend's drawer and discovered a letter I shouldn't have read and wish I hadn't read. Other than that, like that's not my style. Mm-hmm. But I got that phone and I went through everything, and
something hinky is going on.
Oh yeah, at this point I'm like, what is going on? I found, let's see, a lot of things. So for example, I found that he was no longer employed. Well, I knew that he was no longer employed, but I didn't know that he never got that promotion that he claimed. Mm-hmm. So he had claimed that he was a VP at this big old company. That was a lie. I found his severance. I found his real severance document that had the correct severance number. And he had sent me one that was doctored that showed like his severance was actually like 20,000. And he had sent me one that said it was 120. And then when I looked at mine close up, I could see where he like fudged it. Mm-hmm. That was one thing. I found emails where he was writing to I discovered that he was not divorced officially. So he could not have married me, by the way.
So he's married.
Yeah. Now I knew his ex, like I knew that they had broken up, but I thought they were divorced.
Right.
They'd never bothered to get a proper divorce. So here he was proposing to me. We were creating a wedding. He couldn't marry me. There was no like, hey, we need to get a divorce really quick because I'm going to get married. There was none of that.
Right.
What I discovered though was a lot of like, there was one email chain where he wrote to his ex and was like, I can't pick up the kids today. I collapsed in Publix and I went into a coma. It's like, of course, it's like the same thing. Like my car got stolen at the gas station,
right.
Like these crazy stories, probably a drinking binge or a drug binge, or I don't know. I have no idea what he was doing in those times that he was like out of commission for a day or 2 days, but he was doing it the same thing to her that he did to me. and that's when I started wondering, well, all these crazy stories. Oh, one of the other things I discovered was he had always told this story. One of the things that I fell in love with was the story about how he saved his daughter from being kidnapped by his first ex. Like, he flew to Colombia, he saved her, he brought her back. And I was like, oh my God, you're amazing. Turns out he's the one that kidnapped her. I've got letters from the mom, like, how could you take her from me? How could you do this to me? Like, it was the complete, like, the opposite story that he had told me, but he was the perpetrator.
Wow. But in his mind, he's the hero.
I don't know. I mean,
or at least he's going to bring it across that way, right? He's not going to go a bad person. He's saying, I'm this amazing hero.
Right. He stole his daughter. Like, he took her. And then he said
first ex was, so was this the previous woman was the first one, or was he married before that?
He was with someone before that. I don't think they ever got married.
Okay.
But he had 2 daughters with 2 different women. And that was something that, by the way, early on in the relationship, I didn't discover that until 6 months into our relationship. He made it seem like the 2 daughters were from his ex, his ex.
Right.
But it was a friend who told me, and I ended up, she's like, you don't understand. He's not a good guy. He's done this and this. He's got two kids by 2 different women. A lot of people have that. I wasn't going to judge him for that. But my girlfriend tried to talk sense into me, and I wasn't having it. We ended up breaking up, she and I. And I had to go back.
It's really interesting you're saying that, because that's something I understand happens to abused women. Now, this isn't a situation where you're abused, but you're being mentally manipulated, which but I've heard that before, that you will shun people who are trying to give you the right story because you're so manipulated.
Gaslighting.
You have to buy into it. Otherwise you're crazy, right?
Yes. That's the gaslighting piece. And that's really where I could see how women can stay for years and years. Honestly, Lee, if I hadn't been confronted with it like this, I don't think I would have left. Quite honestly. Like, I was really deep into the fairy tale. I was really, like, even when confronted with all this, I had a hard time leaving. I had invested 2.5 years. This was my last chance. Like, I was, that was my belief, right? There was just a lot of reasons why I wasn't, because I would have to face so many of my own demons, and I did, but I wouldn't have done that by myself without really.
I'll say we'll jump forward with the story in a second, but that's interesting you're saying that. Looking back, is there anything that could have, quote unquote, saved you? So your friend she tried to get you out of this relationship and you got rid of her. Looking back, is there anything she could have done or said to convince you? So I'm trying to find a learning here. Maybe there isn't one. Maybe the learning is.
No, I'll tell you what the learning is. The learning is my intuition.
Okay.
The whole time was calling to me. I was physically getting sicker and sicker. My body was trying to alert me to get out. I believe this now, whether on a subconscious level or a spiritual level, or I don't know, but my body knew that something was wrong and wanted to get me out. And I had started feeling like repulsion towards the end. Like, my body was trying to communicate with me, and I was just like staying up here and like the neck up,
Right. So your body, were you physically ill? I mean,
yeah. And actually, so as the story goes, like the breakup happened. And I'll tell you, there's a little bit more. There's a kind of a last piece to that story that I discovered, which was really kind of critical. That happened. And then 2 weeks later, I was getting sicker and sicker. So I went to the doctor, my holistic doctor, and I'd done all these tests, and I went to get my results 2 weeks after the breakup. And I was in bad shape. I was pre-diabetic. My vitamin D was 14, which is really, really, really bad. I was in really bad shape. And my heart had a condition, and I had this genetic mutation, and with, just like all this stuff that I discovered right around then. And I believe that I was getting sicker and sicker because my body was trying to get me out and get me to wake up. He was bad news. He ate badly. And because of, I ate badly when I was with him, there was just a lot of that, it was just not a good, it wasn't good for my body. And I think my body was the one that was trying to wake me up, and my intuition too. So like, there were just things that I was like this a lot, like,
and what about the insurance? Because you said he kept pushing you to get life insurance. Where was that going?
So he didn't push and push, but he was definitely reminding me. So one of the things that I discovered, and I put it together in hindsight. So one of the things I discovered on his phone was a voicemail message from a woman, like very breathy, late night call, like, "Hey, I'm here, waiting for your call," kind of thing. And I was like, okay. So I tracked the number. Like, I got very sleuthy in this whole thing. Tracked the number, found out who it was, found her on Facebook, and discovered that her husband, found an article in the newspaper, found an obituary for her husband who had passed about 6 months earlier. She was in Chicago. So then I found, I mean, I was really kind of obsessed at this point, and that's what happens too. I think that that's normal. I got really OCD about discovering all the lies. I wanted to know everything that I had been duped on, right?
Right, because you've been duped. I mean, crazy amount of duping. I could see that you have to find sanity in your own life. So it makes sense to me.
So I went down the rabbit hole and I went into his, so I was like, Chicago, wait, he proposed the day he got back from Chicago. And he came up with that crazy story about meeting some woman in Chicago, right? That was the crazy,
right.
Like it all started to come back. And I'm like, wait a second. She was a widow. She had just lost her husband 6 months earlier. I don't know from what. It didn't say in the obituary, but it seemed like maybe he had an illness. But what I did find out through like the record searching and all that was that she had gotten a $2 million life insurance settlement.
Oh boy.
Yeah. So what I believe, and what I have no real hard evidence, and I know I did not go to the police or any of that because it's conjecture, it's total speculation, but it came to me in the middle of a dream that was like, oh, I put it all together. It was like, he went to Chicago. I went back to my text messages from that weekend. He disappeared. He seemed like he could be drunk. Like, I remembered a conversation that we had before he disappeared where he was sweaty. It was the whole weird attitude and he wasn't feeling well. He was sick. But then his Uber receipts showed that he had gone to this woman's house because I had her address and come back in the early morning. So he'd spent the night there. And then he gets on a plane, comes back to Miami and proposes.
So,
and asked me to
sounds like he was, it looks like he was plotting possibly to set up your murder for insurance money, because
maybe he was just hoping I'd get into an accident. But I mean, I don't think it was any coincidence that on his phone, one of the things that I discovered was research. Well, what I call research. Right. He had 3 browser windows open to different cases of men murdering their wives or their girlfriends or their fiancés on their honeymoon.
Wow. So, yeah. So, and he lived in this delusional world. So this is, yeah. The stories I've heard, right, is that this is what it sounds like he was doing. I mean, it makes sense, right? He's wooing you. He asked you to marry him. Now you suddenly have to get life insurance, and then he looks up how to kill you.
Like I said, this is what I believe is true. This is what my heart believes is true. Mm-hmm. It might not be, and maybe he was toying with the idea. Maybe he never would have gone through with it. Maybe he was, following a rabbit hole and, maybe it was all delusional. I don't know. What I do know is that we had a hiking trip to Colorado planned for the summer. And there's no way he could have married me in November unless he got a divorce. So.
And now he's gone. You said he just disappeared.
I blocked him on every channel. I don't stay in touch with his ex. And I have no idea. I have not seen one iota of him. And yes, every once in a while I've gone to the internet just to check, just to see. I found nothing. I find it hard to believe that he could have disappeared completely from his life, given that he had 2 kids, he had the ex, but I haven't.
Yeah. Well, that's an incredible story. And I wish I could go on for another half hour. Believe it or not, we're at the end of our time already. But I think your story is amazing. It's incredible. It's mind-boggling. But I think maybe women can learn a little bit from it. And what the lesson to me is, you have to listen to your inner voice, because that's why it's there. I mean, you gave up on your friends, but you can't give up on yourself. So, well, thank you so much for joining me today on A Certain Age. This has been amazing. An amazing story. So thanks for being my guest.
My pleasure, Lee. Thank you.